What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a Testify video. Testify is run by Eric Manning, and Eric usually likes to delve into like the historical nature of like the Gospels and the Jesus story in general. And so today, we're going to be talking about his reasons for considering the Gospels to be written by eyewitnesses. And you'll notice that he has very weird sense of logic as far as like reasoning his way through this. So if you want to fuck around and find out why Eric Manning considers the Gospels to be eyewitness narratives, then please stay tuned. Alright, heathens, we are about to get into Eric's video on why the four Gospels are eyewitness accounts. But I want to preface this video by saying that currently mainstream scholarship has indicated that the Gospels are anonymously written. And we come to that conclusion because as they were originally circulated, they did not have any kind of authors attached to them. Like they definitely didn't have the titles that later became attached to the Gospels, and it seems like those that attach those names to those Gospels just did it because it felt right. They just sort of pulled it out of their ass. But the Gospels are in contrast to other historical writings at that time. At that time, other historical writers would have written themselves into the narrative, as well as they would have mentioned that they wrote it. They would have had extensive discussions on their sources, why they were good sources, and they would have, like I said, taken active roles in their narrative. And this is contrary to the Gospel narratives, which seem to be just made up bullshit. Now, there are some mainstream scholars out there that think that there are some nuggets of history contained in the Gospels. We're not going to be really touching on that today. We're really just focusing on, were the Gospels eyewitness accounts? And as you'll see, Eric kind of has some fucked up logic in order to get to his conclusion.
Muslims and skeptics love to claim that the Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses, but by anonymous authors far removed from the events. If that's true, though, it's shocking how often the Gospels nail historical facts, right down to tiny details that are hard to fake. And when you compare them to apocryphal Gospels like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Barnabas, the difference is night and day.
I will agree that comparing the Gospels that eventually became canon to these other Gospels that were just tossed out of the canon or written in a medieval time period are going to be more likely to seem real just because they are in fact closer to the events if they actually happened. But also they were written probably by people that were at least somewhat in the area, and that's a much deeper discussion as to whether or not the actual authors, or however many authors there were for the Gospels, were actually in the area or in the culture at that time. Like I said, that's a different discussion. But yes, comparing the Gospels to later medieval forgeries is going to be an easy night and day comparison. Now, Eric adheres to this idea of undesigned coincidences, and he's got a playlist on his channel where he kind of goes through that. The problem with undesigned coincidences is that they could very easily be designed coincidences. Like, because of how the Gospels were written, they were written with the previous Gospels in mind so that they could make those particular coincidences occur. Eric and those that adhere to undesigned coincidences, they seem to think that their subjective determination of how minor these coincidences are seems to lend credence to the idea that they were not designed and that they are indicative of eyewitness testimony. This is a logical leap because they're leaping from coincidental information to eyewitness accounts. They are failing to take into consideration that these authors knew the works that were previous to them and then could be creating a story that just seems to fit pretty nicely with the other ones. Because they're having to work with an already established framework, they can change a few minor details, but for the most part, they adhere to the same basic storyline. Undesigned coincidences requires you to ignore those things. Of course, Eric is going to tell you that he's not ignoring those things, but this is another fallacy called a composition fallacy. Basically, what he's doing is he's taking these small sets of information, like like small little details that each individual gospel gets right, and then applies it to the whole of the gospel, saying, oh, all of this was written by eyewitnesses. All right, so where we're at right now is Eric is trying to suggest that because the gospels get some minor details correct, that means that it had to have been written by eyewitnesses, and there's no way that they could have just bullshit their way through creating these narratives. Continue, Eric.
In this video, I'm going to look at 4 examples that dismantle this myth, and trust me, it's just the tip of the iceberg. For starters, Luke's gospel tells a story where some Pharisees warn Jesus that Herod Antipas wants to kill him. Jesus shrugs it off, calling Herod a fox and saying that he's heading to Jerusalem anyway. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But dig into the geography and history, and it's clear this isn't something someone just made up. The story appears in a section of Luke's gospel that's hard to pin down chronologically. Scholars call it a chronological narration. Luke chunks things together without worrying about the exact order.
All right, so this is just kind of and I know that he mentioned some scholars there. Well, I mean, he doesn't directly mention scholars. I mean, they hardly ever do. But I mean, regardless of what scholars support that a chronological narration idea, this is just a speculative claim that doesn't really have any underlying evidence for it, other than if you're trying to make the Gospel of Luke coincide with the other Gospels. Instead of what most mainstream scholars are going to tell you, and that's that each Gospel was sort of like a rewrite of the previous Gospels, and these later Gospels had access to the previous Gospels so that they could rewrite those Gospels so that they could present a more accurate view of what actually happened, or at least that's what they're trying to do. So this whole achronological narration thing is only needed if you're trying to like make all of the Gospels tell the same story. They're not. Now, of course, Eric can spout off some, more claims, unsubstantiated claims, in order to make the case that, Luke was doing like a chronological narration, but there's nothing to actually support this. If you actually read the gospel, it's very clearly telling like a linear story, and it's not exactly like picking bits and pieces out from Jesus's life and then applying them in other places. I get it that Eric would make more speculative claims to back up his conclusion, but just because you pile on more speculative claims doesn't make your hypothesis stronger. It actually makes it weaker. If anybody recalls Occam's razor, the more ad hoc suppositions that you add on to your hypothesis, the weaker it's going to get among competing hypotheses. And the hypothesis with the least amount of ad hoc suppositions onto it, these claims, these unsupported claims are tacked onto your hypothesis. The one with the least amount of those is going to be the most likely hypothesis to be true. And currently, I would say that that's the fair error hypothesis, in that, Luke was using Matthew and Mark in order to generate his story. And so what that means is that Luke is very clearly trying to tell a linear progression throughout his narrative.
But here's the thing. If Jesus isn't in Galilee anymore, why would Herod Antipas, who rules in Galilee, be a threat? Luke tells us multiple times that Herod Antipas ruled Galilee, but here's what Luke doesn't mention. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, Herod also ruled Perea, a strip of land east of the Jordan River. And guess where Jesus was the months before his death? Yep, Perea. The other Gospels back this up.
Okay, so obviously Josephus, a Jew writing in the late 1st century, knew about Herod Antipas ruling in that area as well. So that kind of seems like it would lend credence to the idea that whatever author wrote Luke, which it wasn't Luke, but whoever wrote Luke, they most likely would have known that, Herod was also ruling that area. So this seems to be a very easily made up thing about Jesus, that, Jesus was in Perea at that time. Now, I don't think that the Gospel of Luke directly says that that's where Jesus was. Now, I'm not sure if Luke actually says that that's where Jesus was. This may be a conclusion that Eric is coming to based on other gospel information. And if the other gospels contain this information, sans John, because John was written after Luke was written, if the other Gospels contain this information, then it would seem more likely that Luke was just working within the framework that had already been established, and changing up this framework might have made it harder for people to accept his Gospel over the others, because the others had already established this as a fact that Jesus in the months prior to his death was in Perea. All of this seems to be very easily manufactured information about Jesus. I mean, if you're going to make up information about Jesus, Jesus, aren't you going to place Jesus in a very likely situation that matches up with what people that would be reading your story know about it? Like, it would be really weird for everybody to read a book that doesn't have World War II happening, but everybody knows that World War II happened, and you're trying to pass it off as like a real historical thing. Like, if you're trying to pass off a book as a real historical thing and you totally nix World War II, they're not going to actually, read or at least believe in your story that it's an actual representation of what actually happened. So it seems like this would be something that somebody would make up about Jesus. Like, if they're going to place Jesus in a time and place, and then they're going to place him in a time and place, and they're going to make it make sense with what they know about history. This also can illuminate places where we can identify that they really didn't know certain things about the area. Like, there are certain portions of Luke that we know was ripped from Josephus specifically, because of the fact that the author of Luke, of the Gospel of Luke, they get things wrong geographically. And when they talk about Jesus moving around to different places, it's geographically doesn't make sense. But also there are some other things that lend to this idea that whoever wrote Luke was also using Josephus in order to inform his gospel. So it makes total sense for Luke to place Jesus in an area where Herod Antipas would have ruled at that time, and also Josephus would have identified that as well if Luke was also using Josephus, which we have multiple pieces of evidence that suggest that very thing, like hard pieces of evidence. This isn't like some kind of ad hoc thing that we're tacking on to this hypothesis here. These are very real, concrete items that directly tie the Gospel of Luke to Josephus.
Matthew 19:1 and Mark 10:1 say that Jesus went beyond the Jordan. And John 10:40 through 41 says that he hung out where John the Baptist used to baptize. Even though Luke doesn't spell this out, the story lines up perfectly. The Pharisees' warning makes total sense if Jesus was in Perea, where Herod's authorities still applied.
Well, and I mean, if Jesus wasn't in Perea, but was still in an area, like the vast area that Herod Antipas was controlling, it would still make sense. So, like, it seems to work out, even if it's a made up, like, fact about Jesus in this particular respect. What we're really looking for are pieces of information that have to be distinguished from just pure bullshittery. And that's what Eric is not doing in this analysis of his undesigned coincidences here. He's not actually giving us anything that differentiates it from made up bullshit. So, because he's not doing that, there's no way for us to discern between made up bullshit and a real historical fact. The only thing that Eric is giving us and what undesigned coincidences gives us is this whole subjective nature of how perfect it fits together and how small these facts are and how incidental they are to where you just wouldn't make these things up. Basically, he's just saying you wouldn't make this up, without actually providing any kind of real facts that suggest that they wouldn't make this up. In fact, I would say that everything points towards it being most likely made up because of the fact that it so easily works into the common knowledge of that time. You would want to work with the common knowledge of that time. So, like, if it was common knowledge, common enough for Josephus and Antiquities to write about it, then it seems like it would be common enough for anybody that was writing the Gospels to also use that information to make their Gospel more believable.
This detail isn't flashy or forced. Luke just mentions it casually. Getting Herod's jurisdiction right without knowing the specifics isn't easy. It's too precise to be luck and too casual to be staged. It feels rooted in real events.
You see, he makes subjective determinations without actually providing us with any clear methodological way of discerning this fact from fiction. And this very loose criteria of how incidental it is, or how small it is, or how casual it is. The casualness is the thing that really gets me. Like, he just says, this is just dropped casually in the story. The casualness criteria here really kind of gets to me because it just seems to be very subjective in nature. Who's to say what was casual and what was not. I mean, these authors crafted their stories specifically to communicate different theological things about Jesus and theological tenets of Christianity. You think that what they put in the Gospels was not like specifically crafted to create the most believable story or to create the best teachable material to use for witnessing and for teaching Christians? You're going to hang your hat on that subjective casualness of these facts. I'm sorry, but I feel like when you're working with some kind of historical methodology, you need to be very deliberate about your methodology instead of this very ad hoc, subjective bullshit that Eric and Undesigned Coincidences brings to the table.
Now, compare this to the Gospel of Barnabas, a late medieval knockoff trying way too hard to sound legit. It claims Herod Antipas ruled Jerusalem and Judea, but the real Herod Antipas governed Galilee, not Judea. This is what fake history looks like, throwing names around without a clue about the actual history.
Well, I mean, actually, I would say it's the fact that it was written in the medieval time period and that we can't date it prior to that is the first red flag. But I would say them getting these incidental facts wrong about that time period and that place. Very obviously, they didn't have access to anything about that area. They didn't know anything about that area or that time period. And they were obviously writing this document in order to pass on some kind of theological tenet or teach some kind of theological thing about Christianity or Christ. Those would be the red flags that I would hang my hat on as far as like disproving the Gospel of Barnabas or whatever in the hell. I feel like he is doing a false analogy fallacy here, because I mean, he's trying to compare like these very obvious forgeries to the Gospels, and because they're different, because they were created in different time periods with different sets of knowledge, that somehow has any kind of bearing on whether or not the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. The Gospels were written by people that were living in the area or had access to information, more accurate information about that area at that time, and so therefore they're more accurate to common knowledge at that time. But that doesn't mean that they were eyewitnesses. See, this is another one of those logical leaps that we're talking about here, using a false analogy fallacy in order to make that logical leap to eyewitness account.
Here's another one from Luke. He's the only gospel who gives us the story of Jesus raising a widow's son in Nain.
Well, not exactly. That story is actually copied from the Old Testament. So the book that you want to get, if you want to learn more cool facts about like the connections between the Old Testament and the Gospels, I would highly suggest Randall Helm's Gospel Fictions. This was kind of a game changer for me as far as understanding that the Gospels were really just reworking stories that are in the Old Testament in order to present Jesus as this newer and better prophet that's supposed to surpass all the other prophets. And so they basically copied and pasted and changed a little bit from the Old Testament. So I would highly suggest this book, Randall Helm's Gospel Fictions. And we're going to read the section right now that is concerning this particular part. And what I want to do is I just want to read Randall Helms's conclusion about both of these stories when you compare them side by side. Both stories begin with a favorite Septuagintal formula, and it came to pass. Both concern the dead son of a widow. In both, the prophet went to the town where he met the woman at the gate of the city, even though archaeological study has shown that the village of Nain in Galilee never had a wall. Nain's fictional gate is there for literary reasons. Sarepta's gate transferred. In both stories, the prophets speak and touch the dead son, who then rises and speaks. In both stories, it is declared that the miracle certifies the prophet, and both stories conclude with precisely the same words, and he gave him to his mother. It is clear that either Luke or his source consciously modeled the story set in Nain after the miracle at Sarepta. What is even more striking is that all the gospel stories of Jesus' resurrecting a dead loved one are based on the resurrections in the books of Kings. The process culminating in this fact seemed fairly easy to trace. Early Christians knew, on the basis of Isaiah 26:19, that raising of the dead was to be one of the signs of the advent of God's kingdom, an event they saw happening in the person and ministry of Jesus. They knew equally well that events portrayed in the Old Testament were not merely descriptions of the past, but typological foreshadowings of the future, namely of Jesus. The only Old Testament narratives of resurrection are in the stories of Elijah and Elisha. After that, it is not unimaginable to see the widow of Sarepta bewailing an only son as the widow of Nain doing the same. And if you want to go and look for yourself, which I highly suggest that you do, comparing, these stories, it's Luke 7:11 through 16 is the story of the widow's son for Jesus. And then it's 1 Kings 17, 8 to 10, 17, and 19 to 23 that you're really going to want to focus on. But mainly 1 Kings 17, 8 to 23. Now, keep in mind that the gospel authors would have had access to the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. And so when you read your English translation of the Greek text that it was originally written in, you're probably going to see some different words. So in order to notice the connections between the two stories, you would actually have to compare and contrast the Greek versions, like the Greek Septuagint and the Greek versions of the Gospel of Luke. Randall Helms has done this. He's a scholar in this area. He understands how to make these connections, more so than Eric Manning or anybody that's pushing undesigned coincidences. This would be an example of a designed coincidence, because it's not coincidental that they use the exact same phrases in Greek in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. This shows a hard connection between the two. So Jesus resurrecting some dead son is not a historical event. It is modeled off of the Old Testament. Now, I guess you could make the argument that, well, maybe they modeled it off of the Old Testament, that it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. I would say that this whole idea of a resurrecting son or something like that is disproved by the fact that dead people don't resurrect, at least in the ways that the Gospel of Luke is trying to make it seem like, because they're trying to make it seem like he is cold, he is dead, brain dead, whatever in the fuck, dead as a doornail. He should be 6 feet under the ground, but they're, carrying him out to burying him 6 feet in the ground, kind of dead. I mean, this isn't like, oh, they think he's dead. Like, he's fucking cold as shit, okay? But Jesus resurrects him. That's a magical event. And so that is not going to pass the what's called smell test for history. That's not going to be something that's historical. Now, could Jesus have, slapped the shit out of some kid that was like passed out or something, and like he woke up and they're like, oh, resurrection? I guess that's possible. But as far as the story as it's presented in the Gospel of Luke, this is not a historical event. This did not happen. That doesn't mean that Jesus didn't slap the shit out of some kid to wake him up. But what it does mean is that the event as described by Luke did not happen.
Nain is a tiny Galilean town about 10 miles south of Nazareth. Jesus and his crew walk towards the city gate and encounter a funeral procession. The dead man's mom, a widow, is absolutely devastated. Jesus tells her, "Don't cry," then raises her son. Neat story and all, but here's where it gets interesting. The Babylonian Talmud mentions differing funeral customs in Galilee and in Judea. In Judea, mourners walk behind the bier, but in Galilee, they walk in front of it. Knowing that, the story makes perfect sense. Jesus meets the mother first because she's leading the procession out of the gate, then goes to the bier.
So you're telling me that an author that was writing either in the area or at least knew about the culture and customs of the Jewish people in this area, and they wanted to represent this event as happening in a particular place, and because they know the cultural procession, the funeral procession, like how it's done, and they know all this is common knowledge in the area for people that would be writing about this, that means that it has to be historical because they were using common knowledge at the time. I think that the use of common knowledge in order to generate a story makes it far more likely to be something that's just made up, or at least it makes it too ambiguous to use that as a sort of divining rod between fact and fiction. Like this literally has no effect on whether or not it is fact or fiction. It's just the author is writing within the context and with the knowledge of the culture at the time, and that's it. This has no like evidential value as far as discerning between fact and fiction here.
Who would include such a random cultural detail unless they actually knew it?
Yeah, they actually knew it because they knew the culture. So, I mean, this wouldn't have been like some expert thing that they put in there and this somehow indicates like an eyewitness. It just means that they knew about the culture at the time and they knew how funerals were done in that area that they were depicting this event happening in. This literally does not point to any kind of eyewitness. It just points to somebody that knew the culture. This is the kind of logical leap that I'm talking about here, because he leaps from they knew the culture to they had to be an eyewitness. They can know the culture and it not be an eyewitness account of what happened. Though, like, you need to bridge that gap there. And I mean, he's just fucking acting like it's a long jump event at the Olympics and he's just making this logical leap. Jumping across it and shit.
This screams eyewitness testimony.
No, it doesn't. But, you know, I'll let him continue.
Now, compare this again to the Gospel of Barnabas, which hilariously places Nain on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, a huge geographical blunder.
Some guy who didn't know the culture or the geography of the area wrote some bullshit story in the medieval time period, and it doesn't match up with what we know about the area or about the culture. So the fuck what? This is, he's going to continue doing this. I'm not going to repeat myself of what I've already said, but false analogy fallacy, and he's using that as a springboard in order to make his logical leap to eyewitness account for the Gospels, suggesting that, oh, because the Gospels got this cultural aspect of the Jews in this area at the time correct, that lends more credence to it actually being an eyewitness account. It doesn't actually do that. Like I said, he's just using this as a springboard in order to make his logical leap to eyewitnesses.
Let's take a look at a couple of cool examples in John's Gospel. In John 19, the soldiers divide up Jesus' clothes at the crucifixion.
Before we get to his example for, John's Gospel, everybody should know that John's Gospel was written solidly in the 2nd century. Like, it makes sense for it to be written in the 2nd century, but also, like, that's the earliest that we can really place it. Like, some scholars out there like to place it at the end of the 1st century, but John's Gospel definitely knew Luke's Gospel, and Luke had to have been written, like, at least after 93 CE, if not well into the 2nd century. So, like, John's Gospel was definitely a 2nd century document that was written at a specific time for a specific group of people. That's why it's completely different than the other Gospels. It's not included in the Synoptics because the Gospel of John is so different. The Gospel of John presents a completely different form of Jesus, and this form of Jesus that's presented at that point in time, was meant to contradict the Synoptic Gospels and correct them.
As it turns out, Roman law, as noted in Justinian's Digest, lets executioners keep the belongings of the condemned. But there's more here. John implies that there were 4 soldiers without explicitly stating it. He mentions they divided the clothes into 4 shares, one for each soldier. This lines up with Roman military practices, where a standard guard, called a quaternion, was made up of 4 men, and we know this from reading Polybius. John's accuracy is effortless and consistent, the kind of detail you get from somebody who was there, not someone making things up centuries later.
So this is another, like, ad hoc conclusion. He's just making the claim that it was effortless. He's making the claim that it proves that he was an eyewitness. When in reality, the digest of Justinian, right, that he mentioned, as far as us knowing, like, that Quaternion, the court, those 4 soldiers that were looking over the crucifixion of Jesus, that was written in 530 AD. That's the earliest that we can place it, and it probably maybe was written much later than that, but around 530 or so. So you're trying to tell me that common knowledge of how Romans carried out executions, and John understanding that this was how Romans did executions at the time, lends credence to the idea that he was an eyewitness. This is not logically sound. And it's not logically sound because, again, this suffers from the same problems that we pointed out before. This is common knowledge that John would have had access to at the time. He would have probably known how the Romans carried out executions of this type. And so he wrote about those executions because if you write something that's wildly different from how they do it, then people can easily question it. So he wrote within the common knowledge at the time, and that somehow makes it more likely to be eyewitness accounts. Do you understand the problem that I'm pointing out here? He's making that same logical leap again, suggesting that they were eyewitnesses instead of just somebody that knew the culture and the practices at that time. It's a far cry to say, oh, this person knows the culture at that time and this person was an eyewitness of it. Was Justinian an eyewitness of the culture? I mean, he wrote about it in 530 AD. So does that mean that he was an eyewitness to what happened in the first century? Or does he know that just because of different Roman records that laid out the culture at that time? And if this was part of the common knowledge of the culture at that time, then whoever wrote the Gospel of John would have been privy to that information. So it kind of seems like this is yet again not another good criteria for distinguishing between fact and fiction when concerning the Gospels.
Now, contrast this with the so-called Gospel of Peter, which claims Jewish priests were at Jesus' tomb waiting. Levitical law forbids priests from being near the dead. That's the kind of sloppy mistake you would expect from a late forgery.
Well, right. Again, he's using that comparison fallacy, the false analogy. He's trying to say that, oh, look, this is what a real forged document is like, and that's totally different from this document. Again, this suffers from the same problems as before. Yeah, they didn't know the culture. They didn't know like what happened. They didn't take into consideration how the Jews operated at that time. Like they didn't care about that. They were just pushing a theological narrative, right? Versus those that were trying to write a story about some historical events that may or may not have happened, and they were trying to make it seem plausible. There are different motivations there for both documents, and so you can't compare them as a way to bolster one document as being an eyewitness account. It just means that they had different motivations for writing that document, and those motivations would have necessitated working within the common knowledge at that time.
Let's take a look at one more example. At the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus makes a bold move. He stands up on the last day, the climax of the festival, and shouts, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water." Now, why does the timing matter?
Okay, well, this whole story about Jesus being the living water and all this other stuff, and drink of him and everything like that, this actually originates in the Synoptic Gospels, and because it's in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is trying to mimic, what Moses did. Because if you don't recall, Moses wasn't allowed to get into the Promised Land because, he took his rod and he struck a rock with it instead of yelling at it, like a reasonable, non-crazy person. And so when he struck the rock split and water came out. And this was like, supposed to be magical water that was going to prevent the Israelites from dying of dehydration. And so because Moses decided to strike the rock with his staff instead of just yelling at it like a crazy person, God prevented him from getting into the Promised Land. So Jesus presenting himself as the living water, or the waters of life or whatever, and to drink of him and all this other kind of stuff, it's trying to draw on imagery that was already known to the Jews at that time. And by Jesus being the living water, that makes him better than, what Moses did, because Moses was a prophet of God. And because he was a prophet of God, and Jesus is supposed to be the ultimate prophet of God and the Son of God, Jesus has to be the water. He can't just provide the water to people. He has to actually be the water. And so that's the way that Jesus becomes superior to the other prophets. This is a theological thing, not a historical thing. Did Jesus get up on like a chair or something like that and proclaim this to people? Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. We don't know. But my point is that nothing that Eric is about to say is actually going to allow us to differentiate between fact and fiction here. He's just going to say, oh, well, this is just so casual. These connections are so insignificant. These connections are just thrown in there haphazardly. And so there's no way they could design this. When in actuality, there's good theological reasons to include this in there. What I'm saying is that we need better information and better methodology in order to distinguish this event as a real historical thing versus just fictional made-up bullshit.
Back then, the Feast of Tabernacles featured a daily water pouring ceremony from the Pool of Siloam, symbolizing God's provision in spirit. The Talmud even says, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of water never saw a celebration in his days. By the time John's Gospel is written, likely after the temple's destruction in 70 AD, those rituals were history. Jesus' dramatic call to those who are thirsty to come to him and drink and receive a spiritual river of living water makes sense only in the light of the customs of his time. This again looks like testimony of somebody who was actually there, not writing long after the events, just making things up.
Unless there's a theological need to connect Jesus to the prophets of the Old Testament, like Moses, who provided the water the first time by smacking a rock with his rod. That could also be a thing. And being that whoever wrote the Gospel of John was deeply entrenched in Christianity at that time, not just Christianity, but the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and trying to craft a story that connects the two, it makes more sense for him to draw upon the Old Testament and work that in there and connect Jesus to this whole living water idea. Also, it's already established in the previous Gospels that Jesus proclaims to be the living water, to drink of him, or some kind of weird shit like that. I don't know. Honestly, it sounds a bit like some sexual innuendo going on there, drink of me and all this other shit. It seems more like a connection to the Old Testament and to the Synoptic Gospels and this theology that had already been built by previous Gospels, more so than like a real historical figure or a real historical event. Eric is just making that same logical leap to eyewitness testimony, as opposed to just them being in the culture and knowing the previous Gospels. It's far more likely that John just made the story up in order to bolster his own gospel and work within the culture at that time than it is that it's a historical event that actually happened. Not to mention the fact that John was most definitely writing in the 2nd century, so he was definitely making shit up about Jesus, especially considering that a lot of John's gospel contradicts what's in the synoptics.
Now, compare this again to the Gospel of Barnabas. Chapter 15 says the Feast of Tabernacles was near in Jesus' first year of ministry, but chapter 30 brings up the Cenophagea, the exact same festival as happening that year too. The words actually mean the same thing. It's a sloppy repeat that shows zero understanding of Jewish customs. The Gospels nail the details. Culture, geography, you name it, screaming eyewitnesses were here.
Well, actually, the Gospels don't nail like the geography. Like, there's this one particular part in one of the Gospels. I'm sure I'll put it up here in post. So there's this part where Jesus is described as going down through one city to get to another city. But in actuality, Jesus would have to go up to the city and then back down to the city, to the next city, in order to get to the Sea of Galilee. It's very obvious that the Gospel authors, some of them may have known geography of the area, but it seems like they really didn't know like the geography all that well in the area. But regardless of that, that would be more just cherry picking these small details in order to apply that conclusion that, oh, they knew this thing, and apply it to the entirety of all the Gospels and saying that they were eyewitness accounts. Either way you go about it, this video is completely riddled with logical fallacies that allow Eric Manning to make the logical leaps that he needs to make in order to get to these were written by eyewitnesses. None of his conclusions actually follow from the preceding statements, and the preceding statements are all built off of ad hoc claims that are, by definition, not supported by the evidence that we have. He also fails to take into account other possible explanations that seemingly make it ambiguous in determining between history and fiction. This entire video is horrible as far as like actually making a good case for the Gospels to be eyewitness accounts, for all of the reasons that I've already listed.
Forgeries like Barnabas or Peter, they flop hard. Stacking up the real Gospels against the fakes should strengthen your faith.
No, I don't think that the Gospels should strengthen your faith. In fact, I feel like if you actually read the Gospels side by side and you take a critical look at them, then it should definitely make you question what you know about the historical Jesus, if there even was a historical Jesus. I don't think that there was, but we can get into that a different time, or you can go and look at one of my playlists on my channel to figure out why I don't think that Jesus probably existed. But getting back on to like the actual topic here. Like I said before, Eric just simply is not making a compelling argument that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. He's definitely not overcoming the mountains of evidence that we have that point to the ambiguity of the Gospels and the fact that they are not written by eyewitnesses. They are written by authors that were pushing theological tenets and theological narratives in order to teach people things. These were not written by people that actually witnessed the events. They were written much later, and they heavily relied on the Old Testament in order to craft their stories. This is painfully obvious when you compare the Septuagint version of the Old Testament to the gospel narratives. And like I said before, if you want to know more about those connections, definitely pick up Randall Helm's Gospel Fictions. That's a really great book to dive into and to really get sucked into, and to have all of the stories sort of laid out bare for you so that you can see the connections between the Old and the New Testament. Well, that's going to be it for Eric's video today. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I know I didn't. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you thought about Eric's arguments here. Do you think that Eric is spot on? Do you think that he's proven that the Gospels are actually eyewitness accounts and they're written by the people that they say that they're written by as far as the title goes? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.